All right. Good morning. I'm Elizabeth. I'm just gonna kind of go off the outline that I put on the assignment and just go along with that. And so if you want to follow along, start off with the definition of ethics, the study of right and wrong and how we might want to live based on our actions. And so there are three types of ethics: meta-ethics, which focuses on the language and the definition, so like the definition of good and evil and what that means. Applied ethics, which is solving practical moral problems, and then normative ethics, which is what we're going to focus on, and that's like our ways of behaving. Why study ethics? It gives people the ability to question and analyze societal issues. So if you see something, you can think about it critically, and have your own viewpoint on where you stand on it morally. It gives you the ability to find unethical behavior. So if you're looking at a societal issue and you need to decide whether you agree with it or not, you can do that, and it gives you the knowledge to justify morally correct behavior. So normative ethics, which is going to be our focus, it focuses on, and this is a quote from the book, one should act morally using reason to decide the proper way of conducting oneself. That's on page 6. That's kind of the definition of it. And then in that there are two types of theories, I guess you could say. Ethical relativism, which is the focus is each society is different with different perspectives, and so there's not like a one-fits-all kind of standard for an ethical there's not one ethical standard for everyone. And then ethical absolutism is a theory that states that there is one ethical standard that everyone should be held to. So we're going to dive a little bit deeper into those. And ethical relativism kind of states that there's no superior moral code. It understands that we're different and they're tolerant to different ideas of what different moral standards could be. It still gives us the right to criticize other cultures based on their moral grounds, but something the book noted on is that we can't judge based on our moral code. We have to judge based on theirs. So if we're going to judge any cultures or society, it has to be by their standard, not by our own. And within ethical relativism, there's individual relativism and cultural. So individual relativism states that moral beliefs can differ between different people, and then cultural is it varies between different cultures, and that one can get difficult and more complex because how do you define a society or a culture? Where does it begin and where does it end? But it creates more of an area for tolerance and acceptance. So ethical absolutism, basically the belief is there's one true perspective and it's set on that standard, and they have a strong belief of entitlement towards judging others based on that standard. So what happens when there's a moral issue that requires solving? And it depends on where you stand and what theory you look behind. But ethical relativism will look at the situation at hand and kind of work around it and critically think about it, where ethical absolutism will have a very direct answer and it will stick to that no matter what. Okay, so there's the notion of ethical pluralism, and in that there are 4 principles, and this helps us challenge absolute values without ruling them out, so it's kind of a middle ground that we can meet in between these two theories. So the first principle is principle of understanding. This is where you appreciate the meaning of ethical standards held by a different culture, and you kind of inform yourself on the history and the context of the issue at hand. And then the second one is principle of tolerance, where you can acknowledge and accept the existence differences instead of denying them. So you just acknowledge that different cultures have different beliefs, and that's okay, and that we all have different viewpoints, and that's normal. That's very normal. The third one is principle of standing up against evil. So basically, tolerance or acceptance or acknowledgance of other cultures and their differences does not mean that anything goes. So you can't, because it's a different culture, you can't say that murder is okay. So be prepared to stand out for those really wrongdoings. And then the fourth one is principle of fallibility, and it's just being ready and willing to learn and from other people and cultures. So those 4 principles, and if you kind of follow those, will help you find a medium between ethical relativism and ethical absolutism. Okay, so religion and ethics. A lot of people believe that ethics are derived from religious practices or principles, and this can bring out a lot of complicated and conflicting questions. And one of them was a question posed by Socrates, and this is in the book: is conduct right because the gods demand it, or do the gods command it because it is right? So we'll look at each of those ideas. So if it's right because God commands it, then you are submitting to and agreeing to whatever God says without reasoning. So you're just sufficient, and that's what God says, and there's no reason behind it. If moral conduct should come from a religious text, which one do you choose? So if God's commanding it, how do you pick which book to choose from, right? There are a lot of religious texts out there. And then this theory gives God the power to claim anything as morally if he so wishes. So anything could technically be a god. So if you make your own god, if you say God said it, technically anything could be morally right in that mindset. Okay, and then the second concept, God commands it because it is right. So to accept this theory, we have to acknowledge that there was already a set standard of right and wrong before God's analysis or judgment of what is morally correct. So God kind of looked at what was already there and was like, yeah, that's right and that's wrong. This theory conflicts with the foundational belief that God is all-powerful and all-knowing. So because there was a set standard beforehand, that conflicts. Next idea, natural law, is the idea that despite our differences of what we consider right and wrong, there are some common factors to human nature. It represents a search for moral absolutes that define what is normal and natural. As an example, some believe homosexuality is still an unnatural trait. Natural law is best defined as an ethical theory that uses practical reasoning, so it's just common sense. But in some ways, like the homosexuality example, just because it's new doesn't mean it's unnatural. Ethics and law. How do ethics and law collide, and is law a source of ethical standards? So ethics and law are 2 separate things. However, ethical standards can be mirrored in laws. So, for example, murder is considered both illegal and unethical. In other cases, the law can reject or be the opposite of certain ethical standards. So, for example, some people don't believe in abortion, or at one point slavery was legal, but, it's also unethical. So those can also conflict. The last thing we'll focus on is ethical dilemmas. So we all face dilemmas on a day-to-day basis, and we can choose to make decisions based on an ethical framework, or we can choose to abandon those responsibilities. And so when we act on our responsibility, personal ethical dilemmas can come in contrast with ethical issues. So ethical issues are based on social issues, while dilemmas are based on the individual and those day-to-day things. In order to make decisions, we must use critical or intuitive thinking to approach a moral conclusion. And that's basically the summary of chapter 1.